So, as we can see from this chart and this one here, the government spends more than it takes in. Now, much of its spending is mandatory spending, primarily on entitlement programs, which the government is not allowed to change. And then the rest is discretionary spending. The largest part of this is our defense budget, and that makes up almost half of discretionary spending typically. And then the rest of our discretionary spending is everything else the government spends on. It funds this by taking in basically taxes, right? Primarily payroll taxes. Those are our FICA taxes. Those help cover mandatory spending on entitlements, but also individual income taxes, corporate income taxes, and other things like excise taxes and the like. Now, each year this changes slightly, but overall, we can see that our mandatory spending takes up the majority of our spending, and our revenues do not match our spending. So we run at a deficit. This is not the same thing as debt. Deficit just means you spend more than you earn. Debt is what we take on usually to cover the deficit. And they do this typically by selling guaranteed government bonds. And these are usually at extraordinarily low interest rates, unlike us, where we might take out like a credit card to do this, where we're going to be paying pretty high interest. Now, this deficit is basically Congress's fault because they authorize more spending than more in spending than they do in taxes, right? If they raise taxes or lower spending, they could balance the budget, but they choose not to because no one really wants higher taxes or fewer services. And the thing is there's a lot of talk about debt and how we should have a balanced budget, and this debt is terrible, and we shouldn't run at a deficit because we'll just take on more debt. But what's interesting is actually there's no compelling reason the government shouldn't take on debt per se. There are certainly arguments for that point, and if you're interested in them, I encourage you to take more advanced classes on this topic. But the government is not ever required to stop running at a deficit or to pay back all their debt all at once, right? They can just keep running at a deficit, paying back the bonds as they come due, and issuing new bonds. So because they don't ever have to pay back the debt, at the end of the day, it's okay if we keep running at a deficit. But again, this is a very nuanced discussion that I'm making extremely unnuanced. So I encourage you to learn more about this on your own time or in other classes if this is interesting to you. Now, one other note about government debt is that we often hear this argument that China owns a lot of US debt, and often that China owns like more US debt than anyone else, and sometimes like all of US debt tends to get sort of rhetorical after a while. And until recently, they were actually our largest foreign creditor. They owned more of US debt than any other country, but they have since been surpassed by Japan. Japan now holds more debt than China, and you can see that a lot of debt is held by other countries, including the UK and Luxembourg. So overall, foreign holdings don't even account for the largest single chunk of our debt. They only account for about a third of US debt. So China does own a sizable portion of US debt. As of when this chart was put together, it was nearly $1 trillion, but it is still by no means the largest portion of our debt. And actually, the largest single creditor is, amazingly enough, the US government. So the US government has financed its own debt, which is one of the reasons it's okay if we run at a deficit, because, individuals can't finance their own debt. So it's sort of hard to think about that, sort of hard to get a clear grasp on why this is okay, because there's no sort of personal thing we can draw an analogy to. But because the government is allowed to do this, it works out okay. So just keep that in mind when you hear about debt and deficit discussed in the media. What you often hear is a rhetoric-laced sort of thing, which often does not give you the whole picture. And we know that can happen. We know the media can frame things in certain ways, and we know that politicians and other people who use the media and who speak to us through the media may also do their own framing and have their own rhetorical techniques. And their own strategies for how they're going to talk about things. So just remember that there is more to the discussion than we often hear about. So keep that in mind. Debt, deficit are not the same thing, and we can run at a deficit and take on new debt, and China does not own all of our debt.